This video is sponsored by thingpenguin.com. Okay, Seth, I've started recording. Is that okay?
Yes.
Dave Ridley here from ridleyreport.com, speaking with Seth Hipple, probably best known in New Hampshire as the lawyer from Martin and Hipple. Am I still saying that right?
Correct.
Also nhlegalservices.com.
That's correct.
Okay, good. Uh, Yes, you and I used to gather at we both joined the Free Stater gathering often in Manchester back around 2000 the 2009 era. And
That was a long time ago. Feels like a lifetime ago.
yeah, well, to me it doesn't feel like long at all, which is why because I'm so old, I guess, compared to you. But the but you were talking to me before we started about something that I was gonna ask you about anyway. Is that over time you've had critiques of the liberty movement and you've drifted away from it to some extent, and I think that's just a fascinating subject, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to interview you because I think that when people don't start, they start not liking the liberty movement in New Hampshire for some reason. That's, listening to people who feel that way is the best way to hopefully improve the liberty movement. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Yeah, I can see where you're coming from with that. I mean, I'll start off by saying that, I still have I still spend a significant amount of my work and the work of this firm in, trying to address some of the worst government overreaches. We won a excessive force trial against the Manchester Police Department in February of last year. As far as we can tell, it's the first excessive force verdict against any New Hampshire department in at least a decade. They're very difficult to win. That's up on appeal at the first U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the First Circuit right now. We just argued that recently. Um, we also have, let's see, currently we also have a current excessive force case and false arrest case against, actually, I don't believe there's a false arrest claim, just an excessive force claim against also the city of Manchester. Um, and that's also being litigated up in the First Circuit right now. And some may remember the Newfields case, where there were people that were protesting COVID restrictions outside of former Governor Sununu's home and were arrested for that. They were arrested for picketing. I did represent most of those defendants, and we were able to get not guilty verdicts. And we're currently litigating a constitutional violation case against the city related to those arrests as well. So I'm still active in those types of things. But yeah, you're correct that I've in general distanced myself and or cut ties from the so-called New Hampshire Liberty Movement because I don't think I guess that I may have thought that we were doing different things than we were doing at the time. Um,
Sorry, I had muted myself. You can go on if you want, or I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
So, what would you say is your main critique of the New Hampshire liberty movement, the libertarian movement in New Hampshire?
Well, I mean, I think that when I remember being more involved as a younger, more idealistic person, a lot of the discussion was around police abuse, police overreach. And I'm not, by the way, I'm not saying that this applies to every police officer out there, of course. I'm just saying that there are and were a lot of instances of police abuse, and that I didn't feel that there was, I still don't feel that there's adequate consequences for that kind of behavior. Um, but a lot of those people that end up being victims of those kinds of things are people that they have less resources, they have less of a voice. And so those were usually oftentimes the people, that would be talked about. And I remember, videos would circulate about, police brutality and things like that. And then for some reason, Around the time of the George Floyd protests in 2020, um, I noticed that a lot of people, again, in the so-called liberty movement, um, were just very critical of it. And, you know, it was surprising to me, I guess, because we had always been, those of us that had these kinds of views had always been or felt like we were in the minority in a lot of ways. And this was the first time that I could remember where there was actually national attention in a positive way being paid to it. And so when I was hearing the same defenses and critiques of people that were trying to reform the system as have always been used. I mean, since the 1960s onward, they're communists, they're anti-American, this and that. I was just surprised to hear it from the liberty community. I was also surprised that the messaging coming from the liberty community was oftentimes echoing white supremacist rhetoric very explicitly. And this was coming from official channels as well. And that I don't know. I kind of assumed that it was just one of these things where, these are volunteer organizations and somebody got into a position and started using it to do something that most of the members didn't agree with. But the more that I pushed back against it, the more I realized that people were either in agreement with it or just didn't care. And again, I was really surprised that when it seemed that we finally had reached a point where people were willing to listen to this issue, that most of the people I had considered my allies were against it. And that led to kind of a long and painful reevaluation of who my community was and wasn't. I had kind of identified myself with the liberty movement a lot, and I just didn't feel at home there anymore. And that was a difficult conclusion to come to, but it was the only conclusion I could come to after discussing this with so many people over several years and just being disappointed and discouraged over and over and over again with their responses.
That's interesting. I thought you would probably say something along those lines, and it triggers so many different partial agreements, I guess.
Mm.
The For me, there was this moment in early 2017 when I went to a an Antifa event in Colorado Springs, and I was visiting my folks. I had just discovered their website or their Facebook page, and I remember posting something nice because it just said Colorado Springs anti-fascist, and I thought, well, I'm an anti-fascist, so I just remember
Hmm.
posted some, friendly message on their Facebook post. Didn't give them any other thought until there was an event they were going to show up for and try to crash it, right? So Milo Yiannopoulos, I hope I'm saying that correctly,
Hmm.
the right-wing speech
Yeah, that
giver.
provocateur. Yeah.
Yeah, gives a speech.
He's now switched the people that he's grifting to religious people and Christians, so he's grifting a different group than he was before. But yeah.
Okay, better him than me. But the he was giving a speech and they were going to crash it, sort of. So I show up, and the police treated me a lot better than the Antifa did at this event,
Mm.
and it didn't. I still tried to stand up for their rights because the police were trying to restrict them more than they should have. But it immediately put this sour taste in my mouth. They were all trying to cover up the camera. They were freaking out at being filmed from a distance.
Mm.
I don't think a one of them talked to me in any sense that I can recall. So uh, the next Antifa event I went to was better. They treated me better, but just you kind of focus on what you see, not what you hear. And then of course, Black BLM was already a thing then, and then when the Floyd protests happened, there's this idea that the means are more important than the ends. And so for me, I've been supportive. Again, I'd like to think I've been supportive of all the rights of all the people who are involved in BLM, and I don't want them all tainted by actions of a few. And yet if free staters behaved that way, that some of the demonstrators behaved after Floyd was killed, we I'd have to pull back from the free staters.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's how do I put this? In the summer of Floyd, I went to a lot of different demonstrations and events. So I went to demonstrations in Washington, D.C. I mean Manchester, Nashua, but also I I don't know if you remember this, but there was a time the when federal agents were put on the street and they were instructed to remove their badges and not give their names. And that was in Portland. So after that was announced, I went and protested in Portland as well. Got shot by a few rubber bullets. Um,
Wow, wow. Where was this again?
Portland, Oregon.
Well, thank you for thank you for being there.
Well, I specifically went there because of the fact that there were federal agents on the streets without badges who wouldn't give their names. So my primary purpose in going there was I had a body camera and I just went up to every officer I saw and asked them for their name. It was interesting because, they were basically there was a bunch of people gathered outside of the federal courthouse there, or the and it had grown quite a bit. I think that the average number of people before they had put the secret police on the street was around 3,000. I would say that the time that I was there, there were probably estimated around 10,000 people there. So it was a large event. Um, and It was peaceful as far as I could see. People, there were people singing, there were people holding signs, chanting, doing all the things you do at these kinds of things. And then at some point, I actually was surprised by it. I had been looking around, and when I looked back at the federal courthouse, the fence had been removed, and there was a line advancing, and they were shooting tear gas and that kind of thing. So they kept on, telling us to move back, to disperse. But as soon as I would ask them their names, they would just stop talking. So it was interesting. I did this for, I think, a couple hours, just going up to each of them and telling them or asking them what their name was. And of course, they kept on saying, move back. Are you with the press? Things like that. And then I would say, what's your name? And they would just stop talking. Um, and I remember when I came back to New Hampshire, um, a lot of the people that I used to consider my friends were like, oh yeah, that was a big Antifa event, and all those people support socialism and this and that. And it's like, okay, I talked to, and also saying like, well, BLM is a socialist organization, and I think it's easy to you know it's easy to say that to conflate the official organization with the larger movement itself. And most people who I met at these events in Portland and DC and elsewhere had little to no connection with any official organization. Most of them came out organically, and not a single one of them told me that they were there because they wanted, any kind of socialist programs. Um, some of them, I'm sure, had those types of views. People, frankly, there was a wider spectrum of views than you might expect. But most of the people were there for the exact reason you would expect them to be there, and that is that they thought that there was not enough accountability for police officers who broke the law when they were doing their job. And again, I had thought that libertarians would be happy at these kinds of developments, but instead it sounded more like kind of MAGA rhetoric I was hearing from them, and that's only increased as time has gone on.
And I should correct myself if I sometimes I say this backwards. I tried to say that the means are more important than the ends. I may have said that backwards, and if I did, I should correct myself. But
Hmm.
the yeah, yeah, I
Yeah, it's interesting though, Dave, because back in the days of 2009, 2010 when we were talking about earlier, um, if you went and talked to libertarians about like, well, why do you like New Hampshire? They one of the things they would always mention is the right to revolution, right? They were constantly talking and libertarians love to talk about the gun rights, not just yes for like personal defense, but also for overthrowing a tyrannical government, right? There's plenty of rhetoric within the libertarian movement that talks about using force, including deadly force, against government overreach. But somehow, um, if it's not white people, I guess it's not okay. I don't know. I couldn't come up with any real understanding of where the opposition was. Obviously, there were people that crossed the line, and I'm not supporting, property crimes. I'm not supporting people damaging private property or hurting people, but the vast majority of what was going on did not involve that. And frankly, when we're talking about, people getting murdered on the street on camera, and the officers by the way, I know that Derek Chauvin was and the other officers were eventually convicted, but if you remember, it took a long time before they were charged and arrested. And in many ways, I don't think it would have happened if things had settled down after a week or two. I do believe that it required that much pushback before they were even charged in the first place. And in my opinion, those officers being charged and convicted is a major change from what we've seen in the last 60 years in this country, or longer than that.
Well, and
And
also there's another major change to report, although I've only seen this from one source, but I read a year or two ago that the most recent data indicated 800 police kills uh, during, I guess it would have been 2022 or 2023, which is a marked drop. That's a 20% drop over the norm. Usually they kill 1,000 people a year, U.S. Police in America. So I think that may have been a victory on the part of BLM.
well, I mean, when you look at when you watch the video, and I don't want to, get too much. This has been discussed ad nauseum, so I don't want to get into it too much. But when you watch the video, the thing that really struck me about the way that Chauvin acted was how smug he was. This was the way that he reacted when people tried to intervene, was someone who had no concern, none, about facing any repercussions. And when Floyd eventually dies, right, and Chauvin realizes that he's dead, you can tell that this was what he expected because he doesn't react at all to the fact that this guy's dead. And if you watch the way that he then picks Floyd up and kind of tosses his body, um, it's very clear that he was not surprised that Floyd was dead. Um, you know, and he doesn't do what I know every police department protocol calls for, which is, contacting emergency services and such. So it's very clear that not only did he expect that he was going to have killed this guy, but also that he didn't concern himself at all about any consequences. And that speaks volumes to me because it means that this was calculated based on experience, right? Which means that he's done this before. The only difference is there was a camera there this time. And he just so happened to have it happen at the right moment so that it became a national story. But either of those things not being true, and his feeling of impunity would have been just completely justified. And so, it's not surprising that, you're saying, I haven't seen the numbers you're talking about, but it wouldn't be surprising to me to say that there's a 20% drop in these kinds of things. Because if a person has any fear that there's going to be some repercussion, even if it's saying it's a small chance that, there might be some repercussions, they're going to be less likely to do that kind of thing. I mean, that's the general idea of having, laws against murder in the first place, right? Is a deterrent effect. So it makes sense to me that, that has been an effect. I think that's a positive development. I don't see how anyone can say it's a negative development. It also surprised me to hear from the libertarian community people saying, saying like, oh, well, these protesters, they want to defund the police, which is like, okay, first of all, defund the police was a very extreme wing of this movement. It got a lot of coverage because it was, you know, it got a lot of coverage because it was different and outside the norm. But that was not what most people were out there saying. Um, so, but also to hear it from libertarians, I expect to hear it from Republicans, which, I mean, if there's a difference, which frankly, in New Hampshire, I don't really think there is. But I would expect to hear that from the right, but libertarians used to make such a big deal about how they weren't left or right. Um, and so I was unpleasantly surprised by that response.
Yeah, that is my position, by the way. Defund the police, although I'm not saying necessarily that they should be completely defunded, but that I guess as long as I can remember since I became a free stater in 2000, well, since I came since 2004, I guess I would say I've felt that that's the solution is to cut their funding. But the 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 free staters, it seems like some of them, especially the ones that get into office at the state level, it seems like they are treated fairly well by their Republicans and really badly by the Democrats. In my experience, and that's how I'm treated. And so I I think that may have been part of what has affected them in that direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I could see that. Um, a lot of that, though, I think is simply because a lot of them just simply aligned with the right more than they aligned with the left. Although I think that there were a few libertarians who got elected as Democrats, and I think what you're saying is accurate in terms of how well they were accepted. But yeah, I can see that. What I don't see though is I don't want to call it a change in views because I've come to the opinion that there hasn't really been a change in views. I just simply misunderstood the views. I think I took some of the rhetoric at face value, and I shouldn't have. But um, it's one thing to say, you know, we don't support these protests because the defund the police people, they want to increase spending on certain social services because that's generally what the defund the police people would say. If I remember correctly, I mean, they would say things like, take that money and then put it into mental health services, put it into other kinds of services so that police are doing law enforcement. They're not dealing with mental health situations. They're not dealing with, homeless situations, those kinds of things. Basically, have social services in place of police for those things. Um, and so the critique oftentimes was, well, a lot of these people support, more spending on these social services, but it seems that the movement is very easily just kind of waves away all of the supposed disagreements with Republicans and conservatives on things, saying, oh, well, we work with them where we can. But then in this situation, when there's actually a national movement and a small part of that movement is saying increase spending on social services, that just was just a complete block to any kind of support. It didn't really make any sense. It just didn't pass the smell test. And I think it just went to a deeper issue. And I've come to the conclusion that a lot of the people that call themselves libertarians are just Republicans who don't want to admit it.
Well, I'm technically a Republican, but I like to say a Ron Paul Republican, which makes me at odds with the Republican Party platform to some fairly large extent. So I can't, but I can't deny being a Republican and being affected myself by again the fact that especially here in Winchester, oh my gosh, the Republicans are so nice to us, to all the libertarians, and this
Well,
isn't
because
really
that's because the libertarians are Republicans. I mean, so of course they're nice.
well they
Um,
I think they know what I think. I mean, I had a bit part in the BLM thing myself, and I was at the rally in Winchester, and I felt like I probably made them a little bit stronger by being there. I don't know, but the uh, yeah, it's possible they're just guessing what I think and guessing wrong.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing, as far as if you remember, you talking about the Democrats that were elected, that were more libertarian. It wasn't just that the Democratic Party was less accepting of them, but the libertarian, um, like for instance, the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance, um, also didn't include in their grade a lot of things, a lot of the more left libertarian things that they were working on. So it was a constant critique, before some of these people, frankly, just kind of gave up. It was a constant critique that the Liberty rating omitted a lot of things that Liberty Democrats would be supporting. I remember hearing this critique from Elizabeth Edwards. I remember hearing this critique from Joel Winters and others, just that the Liberty rating was heavily weighted towards Republican issues and just completely omitted Democratic ones. And I couldn't see any reason why that would be the case other than just putting a thumb on the scale.
I was kind of on guard for that in 2003 when the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance ratings first came out, and I guess maybe it was 2004, and they had competition back then. So there was the LFOD.org that had their own Liberty ratings, and I trusted them. When the NHLA came out, I was worried they'd be too closely aligned with the Republicans, but at first it didn't seem like they were, and I haven't really picked up on a change there. So I just haven't been watching them as closely as you have, I guess.
Yeah, there's also, another thing I think that has bothered me is the is how easily libertarian the a lot of libertarians parrot talking points that go back a long way, in terms of anti-freedom, that push by anti-freedom people. I mean, like for instance, J. Edgar Hoover, um, one of the big things that he and his mouthpieces in the media used to do, and this of course was back when the CIA and FBI were newer, and so, or at least in their current form. And so it was easier to identify who their mouthpieces in the media were. They weren't so embedded as they are now. But a constant attack from Hoover, and then his allies like Senator Jesse Helms and others, um, was always, always, always that they're communists. They're communist infiltrators. They're being paid to cause problems, and there isn't really a problem. It's just that the communists are paying them to make it like a problem. Um, and in a movement that's constantly like, oh, we don't want to, get government propaganda, they were, without even blinking, started saying that, BLM were a bunch of communists. And it's like, really? I mean, that's, I don't know. There
Yeah,
just wasn't any pushback.
I certainly didn't
Um,
sense, yeah, I certainly didn't sense that,
of
from
course not.
all of
No, because
my
it's not
interactions,
true.
my
I
interactions
mean,
with,
it's a silly
but
thing that any semi-intelligent person should be able to be like, that doesn't even, that seems silly, But um, people in the so-called libertarian movement in New Hampshire just swallowed it whole and parroted it. I saw it everywhere.
Seth,
And
I should warn you that this automatically shuts down in 3 minutes. So if you have anything important you haven't said yet, be sure to say it in the next three. So,
okay.
and the important thing that I have to say is to thank you for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, I mean, I still have friends that I've made over the years that I consider very dear and that are very close to me and that I see often. But overall, I think that I haven't felt at home, especially because the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance has chosen to, for instance, have a keynote speaker who posted, what is it, the 13 words of white supremacy with the word libertarian in place of white, and has been very actively, pushing white supremacist views, both on official and unofficial channels. And they have this guy as their keynote speaker. It's I don't know. Um, it's it's disappointing, but when I look back, I'm mostly disappointed in myself because I feel like I should have seen it sooner, I guess. But that's
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, all views have the same human rights in a sense, and so I can see where they're coming from in terms of not maybe kicking him out of Pork Fest. I don't know. I don't know. Which speaker are you talking about?
not kicking someone out is very different than having them as a keynote
Yeah.
speaker. Yeah.
What
Talking
was
about
his name?
Jeremy Kaufman
He was a keynote speaker?
at the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance. Yes.
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, I wasn't at that one. Uh yeah, so I guess I've sort of been in I got rid of my car in 2014, and so
Mhm.
I don't go to as many events as I used to, so I've automatically sort of been less
I didn't go to
connected
the
to.
event. I just saw that he was a keynote. And I mean, he was on the board of the
Yeah.
FSP until I think it was this year. I mean, so long after he had been pushing these views, he was still on the board. And then, yeah, he was removed mostly because other people couldn't work with him for unrelated reasons, but he was not removed because of his views. And he remained on the board long after his views. And frankly, he's still, accepted in the movement. So that tells me a lot.
Interesting. Okay, well, I'll have to read that sometime. Um Again, thanks, Seth.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Dave.
I
It was
will
good to
probably
talk to
pass
you.
on some of your concerns to Free Talk Live, which reaches 100,000 listeners, even though I'm personally am kind of shadow banned,
Hmm.
on
Yeah,
YouTube, on YouTube.
I haven't listened in a long time. But yeah, I've kind of pulled out of that whole media ecosystem, um, just because like I said, I don't really feel at home.
Well, Free Talk Live is still centrist. Do you value your privacy? Want hardware that works? Get Linux at New Hampshire's very own penguin.com.